I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
The final signature was barely dry when the monarchy's future changed forever. In a private chamber at Buckingham Palace, King Charles placed his pen beside a sealed decree and announced that Catherine would be crowned Britain's sole sovereign. No shared throne, no temporary guardianship, no symbolic promotion. With one irreversible act, the king had chosen the woman who would inherit not merely the crown, but the full burden of royal power. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles watched the room fall silent shortly after dawn. William sat beside Catherine, while Camilla and Princess Anne faced two senior constitutional advisors who had been summoned without explanation. A royal decree, a formal written command, issued under the monarch's authority, lay sealed before them. The king opened it and stated the truth without softening a single word. Catherine would receive the exclusive authority of the crown when his reign ended, and no joint sovereign arrangement would divide that power. Catherine stared at the page, as though it had taken the air from the chamber. Her hands remained still while Charles told her that duty had already chosen her, even if she had never chosen the throne. She finally looked toward William, searching his face for certainty. But the prince carried two emotions at once. Pride rose in him because his wife had earned the monarch's trust. Pain followed because the decision transformed the destiny he had been raised from childhood to accept as his own. William asked when the decree had been prepared, and the king answered that it had existed for months. He had concealed it from nearly everyone, including his eldest son, because he feared pressure from courtiers, resistance inside the household, and a direct challenge before the decision became binding. Catherine heard the warning beneath those words. This was not simply an honor. It was protection against a danger Charles believed had already moved dangerously close to the throne. Camilla noticed a second sealed page beneath the decree and leaned forward before stopping herself. The queen consort asked what else had been decided, but the monarch immediately covered the page with one hand. He did not raise his voice. He only told her that Catherine's elevation was the beginning of his command, not its full meaning. Camilla drew back, yet her eyes remained fixed on the hidden document. Charles pushed the decree across the table. Catherine did not touch it. Several seconds passed before he said her name once, and she finally placed her fingertips against the royal seal. Anne watched that gesture, then turned sharply toward her brother. The Princess Royal understood that ordinary succession had not been changed without a crisis. She asked what had happened to make him believe the monarchy's normal future could no longer protect itself. But the decree could not be understood through its words alone, because every person around that table had arrived carrying a private fear the crown could no longer conceal. Around the table sat a family, but beneath the titles were people facing the destruction of everything they thought had been settled. William had spent his life preparing to inherit. Catherine had built her strength through patience rather than ambition. Camilla had fought decades for recognition beside the king. And Charles, weakened by time and haunted by unfinished duty, now demanded that each of them accept a future none had been allowed to prepare for. William felt the weight of every year that had brought him to that chair. His identity, discipline, public restraint, and private sacrifices had all been shaped around one certainty. One day, he would inherit the throne. Kingship had never been presented to him as a dream. It was a duty waiting at the end of every lesson, every ceremony, and every painful family decision. The line of succession, the formal order determining who inherits the crown, had defined his entire life. Now his father had changed that order with a signature. Catherine read the decree again, but no triumph touched her face. She had not grown up expecting royal power, and she had never built her place through open ambition. Years of scrutiny, family pressure, personal crisis, and measured service had slowly made her the monarchy's most trusted stabilizing force. Yet the honor felt like a threat. She feared the decree would fracture her marriage, isolate her children, and turn every loyal act from her past into supposed proof that she had quietly desired William's birthright. William watched her closely and felt pride collide with humiliation. He loved the woman seated beside him, But he could not silence the question rising inside him. Had Charles lost faith in his own son? The future king looked toward the monarch, searching for reassurance, but his father offered none. Charles remained composed because he knew any softness would weaken the command. Still, the king saw the pain in his eldest child, and understood exactly what his decision had taken from him. Camilla felt another danger forming beneath the family conflict. A sole sovereign would leave no automatic place for her once Charles's reign ended. Her status, household, influence, and access could vanish with the decree's activation. The queen consort had fought for decades to stand beside the monarch, and now Catherine's elevation threatened to erase everything she had secured. She looked toward Anne, hoping for confusion, but the Princess Royal understood the wording too clearly. Catherine was not being named as a temporary caretaker. Charles was transferring the monarchy's moral authority to her alone. William stepped toward a palace window when the meeting paused. Catherine followed and stopped beside him. He asked, "Did you know?" She answered no immediately, but he did not respond. That brief delay wounded her more than anger could have done. When he finally looked at her, he wanted to believe her, yet the decree had already placed suspicion between them. Charles called Anne back as the others began to leave. He handed her a private folder marked with the date of a recent royal ceremony, and told her the truth had begun there. The crown had not changed course because of ambition, but because one hidden incident had convinced Charles that the old line of succession was moving toward disaster. The decisive moment had not occurred in a council chamber or during a constitutional briefing. It happened 3 months earlier, beneath the calm formality of a royal remembrance ceremony at St. George's Chapel. The public saw unity. Charles saw something else. One conversation, overheard behind a closed vestry door, convinced him that the future throne was already becoming a battlefield, and that unless he acted first, the monarchy could be torn apart from within. William entered the vestry moments after the service and shut the door behind him. Anger had stripped away his usual restraint. He confronted Charles over a series of contradictory instructions issued in the prince's name, each one carrying a different version of who would control appointments, public statements, and private access during a future transition. The royal household, meaning the network of advisors and staff serving each senior family member, had become divided between the king's office, William's team, and Camilla's private circle. Confusion was no longer a minor administrative problem. It was becoming a struggle over who would command the next reign before it had even begun. Charles tried to calm his son, but the future king refused to step back. He said the existing court had become impossible to trust, and declared that he would dismantle it the moment he inherited the throne. The words came from frustration, yet the monarch heard something darker inside them. He imagined an accession beginning not with stability, but with removals, revenge, and open division. William saw only a broken system. His father saw a family preparing to tear itself apart. Catherine entered before either man could go further. She looked first at William, then at Charles, and asked both of them to sit. The Princess of Wales did not claim authority, raise her voice, or defend one side against the other. She simply slowed the moment down. Her husband resisted at first, but she held his gaze until he obeyed. The king followed seconds later. With a few quiet sentences, she stopped father and son from saying words that could never be withdrawn. Charles noticed what happened next. Senior aides waiting in the adjoining corridor immediately turned toward Catherine for direction. Nobody asked William how to proceed. Nobody looked toward Camilla. They waited for the woman who had restored order, without demanding obedience. The monarch understood the meaning instantly, and that understanding frightened him more than the argument itself. Anne met her brother later that evening, and gave him a private assessment, recorded in her documented account of the ceremony. The Princess Royal warned that the monarchy might survive not through inherited entitlement, but through the person capable of commanding trust without forcing loyalty. Charles said nothing, yet her words followed him long after she left. Alone, the king removed his ceremonial gloves and placed them on the desk. He wrote Catherine's name on a blank sheet, stared at it for several minutes, then folded the page and locked it away. Weeks later, He placed the vestry transcript inside the folder given to Anne. One sentence had been underlined. Someone inside the palace was already preparing to challenge Catherine's future authority. That warning would lead directly to the confrontation Charles had tried to avoid, when the family gathered again, and the hidden struggle for the crown finally spoke its name. William did not enter the king's private library as a prince seeking clarification. He entered as a son who believed his father had rewritten his life without trusting him enough to explain why. Catherine followed, but Charles ordered the doors closed before she could speak. What began as a demand for answers became the most painful confrontation of the king's reign, forcing three people bound by love to argue over which of them the monarchy could survive. William refused advisors, courtiers, or legal officials. He wanted no polished language and no constitutional shield between himself and his father. Catherine entered because the decree had placed her at the center of the crisis, yet she would not sit in the sovereign's chair near Charles's desk. That chair represented the monarch's formal authority, the power to command the royal household and speak for the crown. Instead, she chose an ordinary seat between father and son, as though position alone might stop the room from breaking apart. William demanded the truth. He accused Charles of preparing him publicly for kingship, while privately deciding he was unfit to inherit. The future king's anger carried something deeper than wounded pride. He feared that his father's final judgment had already been written, and that every sacrifice of his life had ended in silent rejection. Charles listened without interruption, but the king did not retreat. He said the decree was not punishment. His son possessed courage, he explained, but Catherine possessed the rare ability to stop courage from becoming destruction when grief and pride collided. William turned toward his wife, then back to the monarch. He asked whether Camilla had shaped the decision. Charles answered with a revelation recorded in his private briefing notes. The queen consort had warned him that naming Catherine would fracture the household, and had urged him to preserve the traditional succession. The truth stunned the prince, because the woman he suspected of interference had argued against the very decree that displaced him. Catherine finally spoke. She said she would refuse the crown if accepting it meant taking William's future from him. Charles had expected that sacrifice. He told her there was no refusal clause, because duty could not be surrendered simply to spare the feelings of those she loved. The words cut through her restraint. She looked at her husband, but he could not yet meet her eyes. William struck his palm against the desk, then immediately apologized. Catherine reached for his hand, and he pulled away. The rejection lasted only seconds. Slowly, the prince returned his hand to hers, gripping it tightly, as trust trembled beneath love. Charles opened the second sealed page. He told them the decree did more than crown Catherine. It transferred control of the royal household, appointments, archives, and the succession council, the body overseeing the crown's transition, to someone not yet inside the room. The struggle was no longer only about who would wear the crown, because another royal figure had been given the power to make Charles's extraordinary decision impossible to reverse. The monarchy did not survive through jewels, balconies, or ancient words alone. It survived because someone controlled the files, the signatures, the appointments, and the moment each command became irreversible. Charles had chosen Catherine as sovereign, but he had entrusted the decree's protection to Princess Anne. When she entered the council chamber carrying the second sealed page, even William understood that his aunt had not come to offer advice. She had come to enforce the king's will. Anne placed the page beside the decree and read the authority granted to her without hesitation. Charles had named her guardian of the royal transition, a temporary office giving her control over the archives, household appointments, security briefings, and formal transfer of power until Catherine's coronation was complete. The role mattered because a royal command could still be weakened through delay, missing documents, divided staff, or competing instructions. The king had chosen his sister because she sought no throne for herself, commanded respect across the family, and had spent decades placing duty above popularity. William felt the betrayal immediately. He asked why Anne had never warned him that his father's doubts after St. George's Chapel had become a plan to remove him from succession. The Princess Royal held his gaze and admitted that she had known concern was growing, but not every detail of the final decree. She remained silent because one warning would have created factions, pressure campaigns, and private attempts to shape Catherine before Charles reached his decision. Her silence had protected the process, yet it had also left her nephew facing the greatest shock of his life without preparation. Anne opened 3 folders and pushed them across the table. The first contained a transition plan centered on William's immediate accession. The second preserved Camilla's influence through a protected household and permanent advisory access. The third proposed Catherine as regent, a temporary ruler, acting until another sovereign could take full authority. Each document carried notes from unnamed officials who had begun planning rival futures long before the decree was signed. Charles rejected every one of them. The king explained that a regency would leave Catherine powerful but vulnerable, while shared authority would create competing courts inside the same monarchy. His final command removed those dangers by granting her sole sovereign power and placing the transfer under Anne's protection. William looked from the folders to his aunt and understood why the second page mattered more than ceremony. It made resistance harder to organize. Anne placed all 3 files in a row. Then she removed William's plan, followed by the one preserving Camilla's influence, and left only Catherine's folder on the table. She looked directly at the prince and said the crown could not enter its next reign, divided into competing households. The words were firm, but her expression softened when she saw the pain they caused him. A secretary entered without waiting to be announced. Word of the decree had escaped the private council, and Camilla had ordered her staff to assemble before Anne could suspend their authority. Before Catherine could understand the power being placed in her hands, the palace began dividing itself between those accepting the new sovereign and those preparing for one final resistance. The decree had not yet been announced to the nation, but inside the palace, its consequences arrived within minutes. Security lists changed. Private offices received new instructions. Courtiers who had served the same household for years suddenly discovered that their authority ended at noon. And behind the closed doors of her apartments, Camilla understood before anyone told her, Charles's final act had not only raised Catherine, it had begun quietly removing the world the queen had built beside him. Anne moved first. She froze every non-essential appointment and ordered each royal office to surrender its staff lists, access privileges, financial authorizations, and transition documents for immediate review. These transition documents, the files controlling how power, staff, and official duties pass from one reign to the next, now carried more force than any private promise. At the same time, Catherine's household received instructions to prepare for sovereign-level briefings, including state papers, security reports, constitutional correspondence, and direct communication with the government. The machinery had begun turning before she had even accepted what Charles had done. Camilla felt the change in smaller, crueler ways. Staff members paused outside her drawing room before entering, uncertain whether her instructions still carried official weight. The queen consort had not been formally removed, yet hesitation had already entered the household. That hesitation told her everything. Authority did not always disappear with an announcement. Sometimes it vanished through delayed answers, lowered eyes, and doors that no longer opened as quickly as before. Charles visited her privately and found her standing beside a table covered with files from the life they had built together. He tried to explain that the decree protected the monarchy rather than rejected their marriage. The king insisted that choosing Catherine was not an act against his wife. Camilla answered with painful calm. History, she told him, would remember his trust in the Princess of Wales more clearly than it remembered his loyalty to the woman who had stood beside him. Camilla then revealed how much she already knew. She had discovered Charles's handwritten note from the night of the St. George's Chapel confrontation, the page carrying Catherine's name. A member of her office had copied it and circulated its contents through a documented internal memorandum, allowing the secret to spread among competing households. The Queen admitted she had tried to contain the damage, but the leak may have begun inside the very office Anne was now stripping of power. Charles left without finding words strong enough to repair the wound. After the door closed, Camilla removed the Queen's household badge from a folder, turned it over once, and placed it inside a drawer instead of returning it to her desk. The gesture was small, but final. Catherine received her first sovereign briefing minutes later. She closed it unread and asked William to meet her alone in the palace garden, away from Charles, Anne, advisors, and every command of the crown. The institution had made its decision, but the monarchy's future still depended on whether a husband and wife could face each other without titles standing between them. There were no advisors in the garden, no red boxes, no sealed decrees, and no witnesses waiting to record history. There was only William, carrying the weight of a future taken from him, and Catherine, carrying a crown she had never asked to receive. For the first time since Charles signed his command, they spoke not as heirs or symbols, but as husband and wife, confronting the possibility that duty might either divide them forever or bind them more deeply. Catherine chose the same private path they had walked during an earlier family crisis, when uncertainty had threatened to overwhelm them both. The place mattered because it belonged to their shared history, not to royal protocol. She told William that she had not accepted the throne in her heart, even though the decree had already made acceptance a constitutional fact. A constitutional fact meant the decision now carried formal force within the structure of the monarchy, beyond personal preference or emotion. The crown had moved ahead of them. Their marriage was struggling to catch up. William stopped walking and admitted the truth he hated most. His first reaction had not been anger at Charles. It had been jealousy of Catherine. The prince confessed that he saw her name on the decree and felt replaced before he felt proud. He had spent his life preparing for a duty that now seemed to belong to someone else. Yet he refused to hide the bitterness because secrecy had already caused enough damage inside the family. Catherine listened without defending herself. She understood that honesty, however painful, was the only path back to trust. Catherine then revealed her deepest fear. She did not fear the ceremony, the government papers, or the weight of public expectation. She feared becoming the reason their children sensed distance between their parents. The Princess of Wales told him that no crown was worth preserving if it destroyed the family expected to represent continuity. William heard the word children and finally looked at her without suspicion. William shared what Charles had told him privately after the confrontation. The king had offered him the role of Prince Guardian of the Realm, an office responsible for national continuity, defense representation, and supporting the sovereign without sharing the throne. At first, it had sounded like consolation. Now the future king understood its purpose. His father had separated symbolic sovereignty from protective duty. Catherine would unify, he would defend. William removed his signet ring and placed it in her palm. The ring marked his identity and authority within the royal family, but the gesture carried no surrender. He told Catherine he would not stand behind her as a defeated heir. He would stand beside her as the man who understood what the crown demanded and what it could destroy. Catherine closed her fingers around the ring, and William took her other hand. They returned to the palace together, where Anne informed them that the decree would be announced within the hour. Crowds were already gathering outside the gates. Their private reconciliation gave the new reign its first foundation. But beyond the palace walls, Britain was about to decide what Catherine's unprecedented elevation meant. At precisely noon, the palace released a statement unlike any Britain had read before. Within seconds, screens flashed, church bells began to ring, and crowds turned toward royal gates searching for confirmation. The words were formal, but their meaning was unmistakable. Catherine would become the nation's sole sovereign. While commentators struggled to explain the constitutional earthquake, one image captured the public mood. A handwritten sign lifted above the crowd outside Buckingham Palace. "She never asked for power. That is why we trust her." The statement confirmed every part of Charles's decree. Catherine would inherit the crown alone. William would serve as Prince Guardian, the royal office responsible for protecting national continuity and supporting the sovereign without sharing her throne. Anne would control the transition until the coronation was complete. Broadcasters interrupted regular programming as constitutional experts explained that the monarchy had rejected rival courts, divided authority, and competing claims in favor of one clear center of power. Britain did not react with one voice. Supporters praised Catherine's steadiness and argued that her lack of ambition made her worthy of trust. Traditionalists mourned the destiny William had carried since birth and questioned whether any father had the right to rewrite such a future. The debate became deeply personal because the nation did not see one deserving figure defeating another. It saw a husband and wife being asked to survive a decision that elevated them differently. Catherine watched the coverage from inside the palace and felt the praise closing around her. Her breathing changed as commentators described her as the monarchy's savior. William noticed immediately. The prince switched off the television before admiration could become another burden, then reminded her that public hope did not require private perfection. She looked at him with relief, and he stayed beside her as the noise outside grew louder. A major evening newspaper captured the shock with a stark front page. Catherine stood alone beneath the headline, "The Crown Chooses Her," while a smaller image showed William at her side, rather than behind her. The placement mattered. It told the country that his altered destiny did not have to become defeat. Windsor delivered the moment that settled the mood. A crowd fell silent when the royal standard was raised, the flag showing that the sovereign's authority remained present. Then William appeared beside Catherine and began applauding first. Only after his hands came together did the crowd chant her name. She turned toward him, visibly moved, while he continued until the uncertainty broke into acceptance. An elderly woman near the palace gates removed her hat during live coverage and wiped away tears. When a broadcaster asked why the announcement affected her so deeply, she answered that Catherine's calm had carried the country through uncertainty long before anyone promised her a throne. The presenter paused, unable to improve on the words. That evening, Charles requested one final family gathering. He would explain not the legal force of his decree, but the personal truth he wanted history to remember. The nation had accepted the announcement, but only Charles could deliver the final verdict on why Catherine's crown represented sacrifice rather than conquest. That night, the family returned to the same chamber where the decree had first been revealed. The document remained on the table, but the fear surrounding it had changed. William no longer stood apart from Catherine. Camilla no longer searched for a way to reverse what had happened. Anne had completed the transfer of authority. And Charles, facing the people most affected by his final command, prepared to explain why his last royal act was also his most personal confession. Charles looked first at his son and refused to hide behind ceremony. He had not chosen Catherine because William had failed, nor because tradition had become meaningless. The king had acted because the monarchy needed a sovereign who could unite people before asking them to obey. The constitutional crown, meaning the legal authority and public responsibilities carried by the monarch, would belong to her. William's new role would remain permanent and honorable. He would protect the sovereign, advise the realm, represent national defense, and preserve continuity inside the family. Charles then gave his eldest son the apology he should have offered before signing anything. Fear of interference, he admitted, had become an excuse for secrecy. The monarch had denied William the dignity of an earlier conversation, and no constitutional necessity could erase that wound. The prince listened without looking away. He did not pretend the pain had vanished, but he accepted that his father was finally speaking as a parent, rather than hiding behind the crown. Charles turned toward Camilla and acknowledged the cost imposed upon her. His decree ended the influence she had fought for years to build. The queen consort answered with painful honesty. She could not celebrate the decision, but she would not spend the final chapter of their marriage trying to destroy it. Her words carried no triumph and no surrender. They carried acceptance. Charles opened the last sealed clause. Catherine's first act as sovereign, it declared, must reaffirm William's place beside her, so that no courtier, government, or family faction could use the decree to divide them. She signed the affirmation immediately. The future queen then asked Anne to retain control of the transition and invited Camilla to attend the coronation as Charles's wife, not as the center of a rival court. The Princess Royal accepted the duty. The Queen bowed her head and accepted the invitation. Charles rose with difficulty and placed the royal pen in Catherine's hand. William closed his fingers gently over hers. Anne bowed first. Camilla followed after a long pause. Only then did the king allow himself to sit, his divided family finally standing as an alliance rather than competing households. The decree did not become William's defeat, Catherine's ambition, or Camilla's humiliation. It became Charles's final attempt to prevent rivalry from consuming the institution he had inherited. She accepted power as a burden. He chose loyalty without resentment. The Queen accepted an ending without sabotage, while Anne secured the future her brother could no longer protect alone. And so King Charles's last royal decree entered history, not as the command that took a crown away, but as the act that placed it in the hands most willing to carry its weight. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.